Welcome everyone to MailFuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about Gen V Season 2 Episode 6. It's called Cooking Lessons. So, spoilers for the episode as always. We had the big... Well, they hadn't quite escaped yet. Technically the escape happens at the start of this episode. In the last episode was saving Annabeth's life, right? That was the big moment we wrapped up on. If anything, I'm a little bit surprised that Cypher wasn't a little bit more in tuned with this. He's kind of like separate. He's away taking care of the old body. He's doing this physical therapy, and he gets angry when they find out they've escaped. I was kind of thinking the whole murdering of Annabeth was an intentional thing they wanted her to find to provoke her into doing what she was going to do. The fact that that might not be the case, that he didn't seemingly set that up, because he seems genuinely like pissed that she's on the run and he wants her back. He doesn't care about the rest of them. He just wants Marie back. It does make me wonder, okay, so what exactly happened to Annabeth? Why was she killed? Like, who did that exactly? And what was the context of it leading up to it? I genuinely am a little bit just not confused per se, but just there's definitely like a little missing piece there to explain how she ended up in that situation. And unless they're suggesting that Cypher just had her killed because, tough, but he provoked Marie and he was intending on revealing it later. But that doesn't feel like it makes that much sense. So, yeah, I feel like there's maybe something more to learn there, maybe something more about Annabeth. In fact, speaking of Annabeth, she is a soup. She had Compound V in her system, and you see as they're trying to escape that she is clearly sensing stuff. She's like stopping and thinking and saying it's this way. Oh, he's almost here. And then of course, as Emma puts it later, Sam Kool-Aid Man's through the wall and they're able to get out. So it's like, okay, that's interesting. And I actually kind of like how simple this ended up being, this part of it, which is when Marie brings this up to her later, hey, you're a soup, you've got V in your system, I can sense it. Annabeth does just outright say, I didn't want anyone to know that. Right? I kept that to myself. Even like the woman who raised me doesn't know that. It's something that I'm ashamed of. I hate being a soup. I didn't want it to be out there. But now it is, and she can't put that genie back in the bottle. I liked how simple that was in terms of like, it wasn't some big thing that, it felt very human. It felt very simple. It was like anything that someone tries to hide that they're ashamed of. And it feels like we can do a lot with that from like a character growth perspective. Assuming Annabeth sticks around for a while, because part of me kind of thinks she's going to die. Right? She might not. Maybe they've got long-term plans for her. But right now it feels like a big traumatic thing that could happen to Marie by the end of this season is the death of her sister, and having that kind of like propel her into whatever happens next. But yeah, we got some stuff. I do want to say though, when they're on the run and they get to a van and they're driving away towards the start of the episode, there's a few funny lines in this episode that really did make me laugh, and Emma's responsible for a few of them. But the one that got me the most, bizarrely, was when they suggested, hey, how far is it to Canada? And then they all start arguing about wanting to or not wanting to flee the country. And it's Annabeth who says, I don't want to go to a foreign country. And then Emma turns and with a shit-eating grin on her face, like she's in a commercial, says, we're not going to a foreign country. We're going to Canada. That really made me laugh. And I think a big part of it is just her delivery. Like, props to the actress for making that hilarious. It's a little bit funny on concept, but I think her delivery of that really sold like the absurdity of it. But yeah, so they go on the run. They end up at an abandoned library where they kind of hunker down for a little bit, not for very long, admittedly, because the Viking dude shows up. And there's a plot that leads to that with Cypher going to Polarity, who of course is going to be contacted, which also ties into the other line that got me a lot in this episode from Emma, which is when they find a phone in the library, and Emma goes to try and dial it to call Polarity. She's like punching in a couple of numbers and she's like, oh shit. And eventually, like, Sam says, oh, you don't know his number, do you? And then she kind of, like, after a minute, admits it, but doesn't admit it by saying, I don't know his number. She says, I don't know any phone numbers. And that made me laugh, because as much as, like, this is kind of a generation younger than me, right? Arguably 2 generations, if you want to really say that. But, I'm a bit older than these characters, but I'm already there. I don't know any phone numbers for anyone else either. I've not needed to. It's, you know, most of my adult life, you just save numbers in the phone and you don't have to think about it. I don't know a single number of a person's that I could call. So that felt nice. But then she's like, oh, I can log into this computer and DM someone, which gets her to Harper, which then Harper contacts Polarity. But because Cypher can puppet him, they get the location, and that leads to the Viking showing up for a fight. And the fight's good. You know, the fight has a lot of big fun action in it. There's a lot of going through walls. It's interesting that, you know, 2 or 3 of the characters are kind of physically quite strong, so they're the ones that kind of take him on. Whereas the other characters, Kate, whose powers are kind of on the fritz, Emma, who could be useful if she can get big, although when she tries, she can't because she's too freaked out. And then Annabeth, they all kind of hide in the back. And there's an interesting little moment here where Jordan comes out to help Marie with the fight, and then Marie kind of like snaps and says, where's Annabeth? Why aren't you looking after her? And it's kind of like seeing this potential thing that might rift them apart, where like Jordan can tell that this is maybe a big deal because like what she did at the end of last episode by bringing someone back to life makes her immensely powerful, arguably the most powerful person on the planet. And then that'll change everything. And Marie kind of tries to comfort and say, no, nothing changes if we don't want it to. I still love you. I feel like part of me would say, well, it's okay for things to change, but we can still be together through the change. It doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, life as we know it is completely evaporated, but that's kind of what Jordan seems to be thinking, and the look they have in their eye whenever they bring this up. Even though they have some, you know, some sweet moments here or there where they try and comfort each other and whatnot. The Viking stuff, though, all ends because another character from The Boys, well, 2 characters from The Boys, technically, show up, and that is Zoe, Newman's daughter, and Edgar show up, and she's the one that takes out the Viking with her tentacles from the mouth. And this is neat from like a shared universe perspective, just how interlinked The Boys is with Gen V. I have to admit though, it did cross my mind that if you're someone who's just trying Gen V as a standalone show, it's stuff like this where they bring in characters just pretty much out of nowhere. That it would probably be very alienating, and you'd be like, who the hell are these characters? Why are we talking about this? Because the fact is, we spend a good bit of the time in this episode, once they're with Edgar and they go down to his bunker, we spend a lot of time like talking about Homelander, and Homelander is appeared on this show, but he's, you know, he's a main character in the other show. So I am still very curious what a possible Gen V season 3 after The Boys is finished is like, where they don't have like a parent show to like drive the entire universe anymore. They get to kind of drive things themselves. Like obviously I'm sure some of the reality in the show at that point will be fallout from what happens in The Boys. It's still part of the same world, but it doesn't have to worry about tying back into what The Boys is doing next season. It can just kind of go on its own path at that point. Which is not to say that I didn't like this stuff, for the record. I actually kind of loved this idea that the project that Marie was a part of was all about creating godlike soups, right? Soups that are so powerful and are much more powerful than everyone else. And all of the children, like, basically were dying left and right that they tried to do this with, right? It was a complete failure. And they even thought Marie was a failure because her powers didn't show up until she was a little bit older. But they do point out that there was one other person who survived. One other child who made it through the project at some point, because Marie wasn't the first wave of kids they tried it on. They'd been doing this since the 60s. This was Godolkin's whole thing. And the reveal is that Homelander was the one that was successful in the 80s, and that's who he is. And it's like, hey, you might be a match for Homelander, but also a lot of Godolkin's whole thing was controlling soups, and he has lots of notes and like technologies and things in his head that might lead to being able to control them, and possibly even controlling Homelander. And of course, Edgar feels like he's always got like an ulterior motive. It feels like, yeah, he wants to do all this and it aligns with the good guys right now, but he's kind of wanting to do it so like he can be in control of Vought. He wants to be on top again. He wants to be, and maybe he's a better option than a lot of the other people who are trying to be in charge, but it still feels very from a position of power and selfishness than it does. Like, he's not a hero. He's not a heroic character, and I think it bears remembering that whenever we're watching any of these scenes, that he's out in this for himself. And I think he cares about Zoe. He cares about his granddaughter. But, the world at large, it feels like, no, he's not a noble character. by any stretch of the imagination. So I like that. And that also, of course, leads to the discussion about Godolkin and them realizing, because they're all sitting with Edgar, well, not all of them, but some of them are, and Jordan and Kate kind of say, hey, they both look at each other and you can tell they're both thinking the same thing. That old guy that had lots of burns in the chamber in Cypher's house, could that just be him? Could that be Godolkin? Now, of course, I'm already thinking that Godolkin's the one that's puppeting Cypher, so it's actually Godolkin who's like talking through him. Although, having said that, now, obviously he might have just given himself Compound V. It's probably that simple as an answer. But it did occur to me that technically Godolkin didn't start off as a soup, because he was there in the early days of developing Compound V, sorry, I almost said Gen V. Compound V and all that stuff. That said, though, we saw Ashley take Compound V as an adult at the end of last season. We don't know what the outcome of that's going to be yet, but it's entirely possible that as a charred corpse who's barely alive, he was like, well, F it. Might as well shoot this stuff into me and see what power I get. If I survive, then great. And it ended up being a power that's quite useful, seemingly. If I'm right that is him that's puppeting Cypher the entire time. I think that's interesting, especially since the more fuel for that fire is when Edgar's explaining that Godolkin was behind all this research to begin with, and then out of nowhere, this Cypher character started it up again afterwards. And it's like, well, it makes sense that he may actually just be the same person again. Which again leads me to the question of like, who is the body that Cypher actually is then, if that's the case? Like, who is this person? So all this was interesting, like world building stuff. I think this episode is a pretty good episode overall. I don't think it's as good as the last two, and I think it just isn't quite as tight or as exciting from a structural perspective, where, building up to the fight or building up to kind of the potential breakout and getting captured, like all that stuff was like so well paced and exciting those last two episodes. And this isn't bad by any means, but it definitely is the episode where it's slowing down so we can have conversations about what's going on and tease where we're going and that kind of thing. It feels weird to say it's the breather episode, but it kind of is, right? And it feels that way. It feels like this is the calm before things ramp up for the last two episodes. And the fact that, the episode ends with Marie choosing to leave the bunker to go back herself and try and do something. My guess is that she's going to try and make a deal with Cypher to basically give her sister her life back. A big conversation between those two when her sister was blaming her for everything is that I want to go back to my life, and the realization that you can't, like, Vought will be watching like all the places you used to go. If you go back, you're just going to endanger I think it's Pam is the woman that raised her. You're just going to endanger her. You can't go back to that life. You're stuck in this now. And I really appreciated Kate kind of eavesdropping on this conversation. She's kind of there, like in the background. And Kate also, at the end of the episode, is the one to follow Marie out and says, "Hey, let me help you. I think you can fix my powers with your power. Right? If you can heal, then you can heal me." And Marie doesn't do it, of course, and she kind of walks away as if she doesn't really want Kate to come with her. But Kate keeps following anyway. To the moody cover of "Don't Forget About Me" at the end of the episode, which I thought was alright, actually. I didn't mind that. I feel like people who watch my Alien Earth reviews are probably thinking I hate when songs are in TV shows, and that's not true. It just depends on the TV show. In this or in like Peacemaker or something, they feel like they belong. It's like ingrained into kind of the DNA of it. They just don't belong in something like Alien Earth. So... but I think this was an interesting ending, and it felt like Marie is doing something to, I think betrays the wrong word, because she's not really doing anything evil or doing something against the others, but she's sneaking off in the middle of the night because she knows that the others won't let her do this. She knows that Jordan's going to want to talk her out of it, and that they're going to say this is a bad idea, you can't trust Cypher. And if that's even what she's going to do, maybe she's even thinking I might kill Cypher. Maybe that's what she's thinking, right? I think she's going to try and make a deal for her sister, though. I feel like in my gut that's what I'm leaning to. But, whatever she's going to try and do, I think she feels guilty about dragging the others into it, especially her sister. And she wants to try and end this for their sake in some capacity. So, I mean, I think that's a neat place to leave on, and it makes sense for the character progression for her to feel that way. So, and there's a couple of nice moments with her and Jordan, lying in bed beforehand, that feels sweet. They have chemistry, all that stuff. There's a scene between Sam and Emma, in the bunker where where Sam basically wants to apologize for everything he did last season and says that wasn't really him. She's like, it was you though, and he's like, you're right. I want to take responsibility. What I really meant there is that wasn't the best me. That's something his therapist has talked to him about, is the idea of the best him versus the shitty version of him. But he has seemed to want to take some responsibility for what he's done. But he does kind of lead in and says, hopefully after some time we could try again, blah blah blah. And it's it's got the right kind of feeling to it. I think that the tone feels a little awkward, and not in a creepy way, like he's making her uncomfortable or anything, but just in that it's kind of awkward because she's not really feeling that right now. And this comes after, of course, like him seeing the other guy in her DMs and being like, "Who's that? Maybe we should message Greg." That was the line that got me a little bit, got me laughing a little bit. Actually, was him saying maybe we should DM Greg. Like it's the really kind of like catty response he was like throwing out there. But yeah, I think that stuff is I enjoyed this more than what Sam was up to last episode for sure. Even though the stuff last episode was clearly important for getting to a certain point, it's just more interesting being a part of the group. That said, though, I'm not really like invested in him and Emma being a couple again necessarily. I don't know if that feels. I guess I just don't know if it feels like it benefits either of them for that to be what happens. I feel like Marie and Jordan is such an interesting pairing, and everything they've done with them this season, for the most part, has been kind of surprisingly good. And just in the sense of how they've tackled it, the conflicts they've given them, the way they've like been forced into these positions against each other, and it feels like there's a good kind of like sweet core to that relationship. Whereas with Emma and Sam, while it was definitely a little bit sweet when they first kind of had feelings for each other, it does kind of feel like they're both better off being able to like move on to other things. And maybe one of the things that Sam's going to maybe learn and grow up with is the idea that he does also have to move on and he can't just retreat to Emma. But it's I think the scene's well performed, and they leave it off in a kind of, again, a very natural feeling place to me. The awkwardness feels genuine. It feels like kind of that same awkward thing of, oh, we had a bad breakup and now I kind of want to be back together, but you clearly aren't feeling that, but I'm trying to convince you, and just all the awkwardness that comes from that kind of setup. So, I mean, that's that. I mean, I kind of glossed over the Cypher Polarity stuff. Notably, Polarity, who after being made to slap himself in the face repeatedly, is able to fight back against his power with his own power for a little bit, and kind of like sends like a magnetic force at Cypher, which sends him flying out the window. But then he's disappeared like Michael Myers. He's not lying there when he looks outside. And Polarity's still pretty messed up. He's still kind of crawling around and barely moving. He's still in a pretty bad shape because of his ongoing health problems related to his powers. So yeah, and there's a lot more of Cypher talking about Andre again, and rubbing that in his face and trying to make him feel all sorts of manners of things. So worth mentioning that. So again, just to remind everyone, Cypher, or whoever's puppeting Cypher in this case, Godolkin, is a villain, and he's a pretty good villain at that. Very easy to hate and rally against. There was that scene with Annabeth talking to Zoe, which was alright. It was interesting because it felt like Zoe was getting a little bit more of her own character time than she ever did on The Boys, which I guess makes sense because she's, I mean, not on her own, she's got Edgar, but like she's getting a little bit more of her own spotlight here, I guess. I wonder how much more we'll see of her in general, not just specifically in this show, but just between the two of them. But yeah, I mean, it was kind of going into the story about how in Halloween, because Annabeth was so shy and scared that Marie would go out and do all the trick-or-treating and then bring her back like half of her haul, if you will. So I think it's setting up some moments between them. I think the challenge with Annabeth as a character right now that maybe they've not quite solved is that for so long she was a plot like point. She was a MacGuffin. She was the person that Marie was looking for, but she wasn't really a character in of herself. She was just she was the goal. She was the thing Marie was going for the entire time, and now she's here. But now she is here, and she has scenes, and she has to be a character, and we have to kind of buy into her like animosity towards Marie and how that relationship is very much damaged, and see Marie's reaction to it. I did find myself a little bit in the scenes where she is with Marie, kind of like thinking it was working from Marie's side, where I'm seeing how bad this affects her, that Annabeth is saying these things. But I don't know if Annabeth herself feels like a fully fleshed out character yet, where I'm invested in why she feels these things, and in her own way, in her own side of this plot. It kind of feels like it's one-sided, and I think that's tough to combat, because one character is our main character who have been with since the start of the show, and the other one we have just introduced after all this time. And I think it can be a little bit of a challenge to make them feel like an also equal fleshed out character. And I guess maybe that's partly why I feel like they might just be planning on killing her off by the time we get to the end of the season. But so it's not like a huge complaint. I don't think it hinders things too much, but I was feeling that a little bit whenever they were having their scenes where, and arguably you could say, oh, obviously I side with Marie more, I know her more, I care about her more, but it does feel like to me like I was just a bit more invested in her side of things, and maybe that just makes sense. But regardless, I guess that's one thing worth mentioning. But that is my thoughts on this episode of Gen V. We have 2 more left in the season, so hopefully big things await. Still excited about what the end game is, and the fact that we're talking about someone equally as powerful as Homelander does make me think that regardless of the outcome of this season, I'm kind of expecting Marie to at least appear in season 5 of The Boys at this point. It feels almost impossible that she won't at least show up to help fight or something at some point, with Homelander. So yeah, let me know what you thought of the episode in the comments. Like, subscribe, all that usual stuff. You can support everything over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV or via YouTube membership. Thanks to everyone who already does. It has been a pleasure. We'll see you again next time. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?